Darkness is not cover. Not anymore. Not on the Eastern Front in April, where Ukrainian anti-tank crews with thermal optics see every warm engine, every exhaust signature, every body heat trace against the cold night ground as clearly as if the column were moving in daylight. The Russian commanders who ordered a night reinforcement movement along a forest road in eastern Ukraine had made a calculation. Move in darkness, avoid Ukrainian observation, deliver the infantry reinforcement to the forward positions without the engagement risk that daytime movement creates. Ukrainian anti-tank crews were already in position before the column left its assembly area. Their thermal sights were already warm. They were already waiting. What followed on a mid-April night, when temperatures had dropped back toward freezing as they do in eastern Ukraine in the second half of spring, was the systematic destruction of a Russian reinforcement column that never reached the positions it was supposed to reinforce. The head of the column stopped first, then the tail, then everything in between, methodically, one vehicle at a time, by Ukrainian anti-tank missile crews who were fighting a night battle in conditions that were, for their equipment and their training, conditions of full visibility. This is the story of that engagement. This is what Ukrainian anti-tank crews did to a Russian reinforcement column on a forest road in the middle of the night. And this is what Russia lost, not only in vehicles and soldiers, but in the forward positions that waited for reinforcement that never arrived. The intelligence that positioned Ukrainian anti-tank crews along the column's route had been developed over the preceding 36 hours. Ukrainian surveillance of Russian rear area activity had noted the assembly of infantry elements, the specific pattern of soldiers moving to a staging area, equipment being distributed, the logistics activity associated with the preparation of a significant force movement. The size of the assembly suggested a reinforcement mission rather than a routine logistics run. Too many personnel, too much individual soldier equipment, too little vehicle-carried supplies. Someone was moving combat power to the front, not fuel and ammunition. Ukrainian analysts assessed the probable route. The forest road was the most likely option, a hard-surface track through woodland that connected the Russian rear assembly area to the forward positions by a route that offered tree cover against overhead drone observation at altitude. Russian commanders choosing to move at night by a route with overhead tree cover were applying multiple layers of concealment simultaneously. Darkness, tree canopy, and the ambient noise of forest terrain that would partially mask vehicle engine sounds from Ukrainian ground observation posts. The concealment that the forest road offered against visual observation from above was real. Ukrainian drone operators at standard operational altitude would have had limited visibility of vehicles moving under tree cover. What Russian planners had not adequately weighted was Ukrainian thermal capability at ground level, the thermal imaging systems on Ukrainian anti-tank platforms, and the night vision and thermal equipment that Ukrainian anti-tank crews carry, which are not degraded by tree canopy because they are operating from ground positions with direct lateral sight lines to the road rather than from altitude. Ukrainian anti-tank crews moved to their positions during the evening, before the Russian column was expected to begin its movement. They used the same forest terrain that Russian planners had thought would provide concealment, moving through the tree lines on either side of the road to reach positions with sight lines to specific stretches of the route. The positions had been selected from terrain analysis. Points where the road curved or crossed open ground, where vehicle speed would be reduced, where the approach angles for anti-tank missiles would be optimal, and where Ukrainian crews could observe an extended section of the road rather than a narrow slice. The thermal imaging equipment that Ukrainian anti-tank crews were using does not care about darkness. At mid-April temperatures, nights dropping to near freezing as the warmth of the day dissipates, the thermal contrast between a running vehicle engine and the surrounding ground is stark. A column of BTR armored personnel carriers moving along a forest road at night appears to a thermal sight as a sequence of bright signatures against a cold background. The tree canopy above does not matter because the thermal sight is looking laterally, not vertically. The darkness does not matter because the thermal sight is reading temperature differentials, not reflected light. Russian commanders moved their column under conditions they assessed as concealing. They were visible from the moment the lead vehicle's engine warmed up. Ukrainian anti-tank crews watched the column approach through their thermal sights. The lead element, a BTR-82A serving as the advanced security vehicle, was the first target identified. Ukrainian crews waited until it reached a predetermined trigger point, a curve in the road where the advanced vehicle would be in a position that the vehicles following it could not easily see and could not quickly reverse away from. Then the engagement began. The first missile struck the lead BTR on its left side at a range of approximately 600 meters, within the reliable engagement envelope of the anti-tank missile system, and at the angle that provides maximum penetration effectiveness against the vehicle's side armor. The BTR stopped. The road ahead was blocked. The column behind it had nowhere to go forward. The tail engagement was executed simultaneously. A second anti-tank crew, positioned several hundred meters to the rear of where the lead strike occurred, engaging the last vehicle in the column at the same moment the first crew fired. This simultaneous head and tail engagement is the standard blocking procedure that Ukrainian anti-tank crews have practiced specifically for column engagements. Stop the front, stop the back, trap everything in between. The column, already committed to a narrow forest road with limited off-road options at night, became a sequence of stationary targets between two burning vehicles. Russian vehicle crews attempted to assess their situation. The darkness that was supposed to protect them was providing no useful information about where the threat was coming from. Anti-tank missiles fired from forest positions produced no visible muzzle flash at the range of engagement, and the thermal imaging that Russian vehicle commanders were using to observe their surroundings was not resolving the positions of Ukrainian crews in the tree lines. The column was under fire from directions it could not identify, on a road it could not advance along and could not easily leave, in conditions that were supposed to be its protection and had become its trap. Ukrainian anti-tank crews worked through the column systematically over the following 30 minutes. Each crew maintained its thermal discipline, firing, observing the impact, assessing the next target, firing again. The engagement was not hurried. The column was immobilized. The targets were not going anywhere. The priority was not speed but completeness, ensuring that each vehicle was engaged and destroyed rather than leaving damaged vehicles that might be recovered or whose crews might organize a defensive response. Several BTR crews attempted to dismount their infantry and establish a perimeter. Dismounted soldiers on a forest road at night, attempting to identify and engage thermal-equipped Ukrainian anti-tank crews in established positions in the tree lines, are at a severe disadvantage. The Ukrainian crews could see the soldiers moving. The soldiers could not see the Ukrainian crews. Ukrainian infantry teams that had been positioned as close-in security for the anti-tank positions engaged the dismounted Russian soldiers who moved toward their sectors. The reinforcement column did not reach its destination. The Russian forward positions that had been expecting reinforcement, the infantry units at the front that needed the additional combat power the column was bringing, received nothing. The column that was supposed to deliver that reinforcement was on a forest road in eastern Ukraine, its vehicles burning in sequence, its infantry either casualties or scattered into the forest. Now let us account for what Russia lost. The BTR-82A armored personnel carriers destroyed in this engagement represent the primary materiel loss. The BTR-82A carries a replacement cost of approximately $600,000 to $900,000 USD per unit under current Russian procurement conditions. The column, assessed at 8 to 12 vehicles based on the reinforcement mission size and the approach route capacity, represents a combined vehicle loss of $4.8 to $10.8 million in armored vehicles alone. The infantry casualties represent the operationally more significant loss. A reinforcement column of this type typically carries between 80 and 150 soldiers. The company's strength or larger reinforcement that the forward positions were requesting. Ukrainian anti-tank fires, dismounted infantry engagement, and the disorientation of a column attacked at night on a forest road produced casualties that, while not precisely quantifiable from external observation, Ukrainian field reporting indicates were substantial. The soldiers who were killed or wounded in this engagement were the combat power that was supposed to shore up a section of the Russian front line that needed reinforcement. Russian forward positions that were expecting those soldiers now face the tactical problem of operating understrengthed, with the manpower and firepower gaps that the reinforcement was supposed to fill still unfilled. The mission that the column was supposed to accomplish, reinforcing forward positions before Ukrainian forces could exploit the weakness that Russian commanders had identified, was not accomplished. The weakness remains. Ukrainian commanders are aware of it. The combined material and operational cost of this engagement, 4.8 to 10.8 million in direct vehicle losses, substantial personnel casualties in a combat specialty that Russian manpower pipelines are struggling to replace, and the operational consequence of forward positions that remain undermanned and vulnerable to the Ukrainian action that the reinforcement was intended to prevent. Ukrainian anti-tank crews achieved this outcome at night, in a forest, against a column that Russian commanders had designed to be invisible. They achieved it because their equipment makes darkness irrelevant, because their intelligence preparation had positioned them correctly before the column moved, and because their training had given them the specific procedures: simultaneous head and tail engagement, systematic work through the trapped column, infantry security for the crew positions. That turned the engagement from a series of individual missile shots into a complete destruction of a formed military unit. The forest road is still dark. The BTRs are still burning. And the Ukrainian anti-tank crews who turned night from a Russian asset into a Ukrainian advantage are back in their positions, their thermal sights cooling, their ammunition states being assessed, their commanders planning the next operation. Russia moved in darkness, expecting safety. Ukrainian thermal sights saw them as clearly as if it were noon. The column that was supposed to reinforce the Russian front never arrived. Ukraine sees in the dark. Ukraine strikes in the dark. Ukraine holds the front that the darkness was supposed to let Russia reinforce. To fully understand what happened on that forest road and why the outcome was as complete as it was, it is necessary to examine the specific nature of thermal imaging as a military capability and what it means for the character of night operations on the Eastern Front, because the engagement described in this video is not an isolated event. It is a representative example of a pattern that has fundamentally changed how night fighting works in this conflict. Thermal imaging does not work the way most people imagine it. It is not simply night vision. It is not an amplification of available light that makes dark scenes visible. It is the detection of heat differentials, the measurement of temperature differences between objects and their backgrounds. A vehicle engine that has been running for several minutes radiates heat at temperatures that create an enormous contrast against the cold April ground. A human body radiates heat at temperatures visible to a thermal system from hundreds of meters. Even a footprint in cold mud retains a heat trace that a sensitive thermal sensor can detect minutes after a person has walked through. For Ukrainian anti-tank crews operating in the mid-April cold of eastern Ukraine, nights that drop close to freezing as the accumulated warmth of the longer April days dissipates after sunset, thermal conditions are close to optimal. The cold background makes warm signatures stand out with maximum contrast. A column of vehicles with running engines on a cold forest road is not merely visible to a thermal sight, it is luminous. Every vehicle appears as a bright signature against a dark background with a clarity that daylight visual targeting cannot always achieve. Because thermal imaging is not degraded by shadows, by camouflage patterns, by the visual complexity of a forest environment at night. Russian commanders who planned a night movement along a tree-covered road had assessed their concealment based on visual observation principles. The tree canopy would block overhead observation from drones at altitude. The darkness would prevent visual identification by Ukrainian ground observation posts. The forest terrain would mask vehicle engine sounds with ambient noise. All of these assessments were correct within the framework of visual and acoustic observation that they were applying. None of them addressed what thermal imaging from ground-level positions would see. This gap between Russian planning assumptions and Ukrainian sensor capabilities has been a recurring feature of the conflict, and Ukrainian forces have consistently exploited it. Russian tactical planning at the junior and mid-grade officer level often reflects training that was developed before the proliferation of high-quality thermal imaging, down to the individual crew level that modern military equipment has enabled. The night movement doctrine that Russian officers learned in their training emphasized concealment from visual observation. It did not fully account for an opponent where anti-tank crews routinely have thermal imaging capability that renders visual concealment irrelevant. Ukrainian anti-tank crews in eastern Ukraine have had thermal imaging integrated into their operational routine long enough that they think in thermal terms when planning engagements. When they assess a potential firing position, they are assessing not just the visual sightline to the expected target location, but the thermal sightline, the unobstructed path for thermal radiation that will make the target visible and engageable regardless of lighting conditions. When they plan their movement to the firing position, they are thinking about minimizing their own thermal signature, avoiding movement in areas where their body heat might be visible to Russian thermal systems, using the terrain to mask their approach. The positions that Ukrainian anti-tank crews occupied along the forest road before the Russian column moved were selected specifically for their thermal observation angles. The crews had walked the terrain during daylight, hours before the expected engagement, identifying the exact points where the road was visible through gaps in the tree line at the lateral angles that provide optimal engagement geometry. They had measured the distances. They had verified that their thermal systems could resolve vehicle-sized targets at those ranges in the expected temperature conditions. They had practiced the engagement sequence. Which crew would fire first? What the simultaneous trigger would be? How they would shift targets after the lead and tail vehicles were destroyed. When the column appeared in their thermal sights, the preparation had already been done. What remained was execution. The systematic destruction of the trapped column over 30 minutes also reflects specific training and doctrine that Ukrainian anti-tank crews have developed for exactly this type of engagement. Standard military guidance for anti-tank ambushes emphasizes the importance of destroying vehicles quickly to prevent crews from dismounting and organizing a response before all vehicles are engaged. Ukrainian crews working through a column of 8 to 12 vehicles in 30 minutes were maintaining a pace of engagement, approximately one vehicle every 2 to 3 minutes, that reflects trained procedures rather than improvised response. Each crew had a target assignment sequence. They knew which vehicle they were engaging next when the current engagement concluded. The engagement was not a series of individual decisions made in real time. It was the execution of a prepared plan. The decision of several Russian BTR crews to dismount their infantry represents the moment when individual Russian soldiers had to make choices in conditions of maximum stress and minimum information. They had been passengers in vehicles under attack from an invisible threat in conditions they could not see clearly. They had no information about the number of Ukrainian crews engaging them, no information about the positions those crews occupied, no information about the terrain between their vehicles and the threat. The training response, dismount, establish a perimeter, identify and engage the threat, was the correct doctrinal response to an ambush. But executing that response against an opponent with thermal imaging, in terrain the opponent had prepared and pre-positioned in at night, represents a task whose probability of success was extremely low, regardless of the individual courage and training of the soldiers attempting it. The Ukrainian infantry teams that had been positioned as crew security for the anti-tank positions were prepared for exactly this dismount response. Their positions were selected to cover the most probable dismount avenues, the points where BTR crews exiting their vehicles would most naturally move toward. Their thermal imaging confirmed the presence of dismounted soldiers in their sectors. They engaged. This layered defensive arrangement, anti-tank crews for the vehicles, infantry teams for the dismounts, reflects the combined arms integration that Ukrainian defensive planning has built into even small unit operations. The anti-tank crews were not solely responsible for defeating the entire column threat. They were responsible for the vehicles. The infantry teams were responsible for the dismounts. Each element of the defensive plan handled the threat category it was assigned. The overall result was more complete than either element could have achieved alone. The operational consequence of the column's destruction, the forward positions that expected reinforcement and did not receive it, deserves specific attention because it illustrates the second-order effects that tactical success creates. Russian forward positions in the sector that had been requesting reinforcement did so because their current manning and combat power were insufficient for the defensive and offensive tasks they were being assigned. The reinforcement request was not administrative paperwork. It was a statement from frontline commanders that they did not have enough soldiers and firepower to hold what they were holding or to execute what they were being ordered to execute. The reinforcement column was the answer to that statement. Its destruction means the answer did not arrive. Ukrainian commanders are aware of this. Ukrainian intelligence that identified the reinforcement column and positioned anti-tank crews to destroy it was also intelligence about Russian capability and intention in the sector. About where Russian forces are undermanned, about where Russian commanders assessed their line was vulnerable, about where Ukrainian action against Russian positions would encounter less resistance than in other sectors. The destruction of the column was not just a tactical win, it was an intelligence gain about Russian vulnerabilities that Ukrainian operational planning will use. The forest is quiet now. The BTRs have burned down to their running gear. The cold April night has continued past the engagement, the temperatures dropping further as the hours move toward dawn. Ukrainian anti-tank crews have withdrawn from their positions, checked their equipment, reported their results, and begun moving to the next assignment that their commander has already identified. The reinforcement that Russia sent did not arrive. The positions that needed it are still waiting. The Ukrainian anti-tank crews who prevented it are already thinking about the next column. Ukraine sees in the dark. Ukraine plans in advance. Ukraine destroys the reinforcements before they can reinforce. And the front holds, undermanned on one side, fully alert on the other, in the cold April night of eastern Ukraine. There is one final point worth making about this engagement, one that connects the thermal imaging, the anti-tank missiles, and the 30 minutes of systematic destruction to the experience of the Ukrainian soldiers who conducted it. Anti-tank crews operating at night in forward positions in eastern Ukraine are doing something that requires a specific kind of courage that is different from the courage required in daylight combat. In the dark, in a forest with a Russian column approaching that you can see in your thermal sight, but that you know cannot easily see you. There is a temptation to believe that invisibility is the same as safety. Ukrainian anti-tank crews know it is not. They know that if any element of their position is detected, if a Russian vehicle commander happens to scan the tree line at the right moment, if a Russian drone operating at low altitude under tree cover happens to observe their movement, the engagement becomes bilateral. The advantage of thermal imaging and prepared positions does not make them invulnerable, it makes them effective. They moved to their positions in the cold April evening knowing the column was coming. They waited in the darkness for hours knowing that every minute brought the column closer. They executed the engagement knowing that each missile fired potentially revealed their position to surviving Russian crews. They did all of this because the soldiers in the Russian column were heading toward a Ukrainian front line that needed protecting. The reinforcement column was not an abstract military target. It was the soldiers and the combat power that Russian commanders were sending to fight against the Ukrainian defenders holding the line. Preventing that reinforcement from arriving was directly and specifically protecting those Ukrainian defenders. The Ukrainian anti-tank crews understood this. They were cold. They were patient. They were effective. And when the engagement was over and the column was destroyed and the forest was quiet again, the Ukrainian front line was still there. Still held, still manned, still the barrier between Russian forces and the Ukrainian ground behind it. Ukraine operates in the dark with open eyes. Ukraine strikes before the reinforcement arrives. Ukraine holds,